Greetings, fellow thinkers and drinkers, once again, and now following on, almost chronologically, from my review of Dio's impact on Black Sabbath. Now, as part of that review, I argued that Dio's original departure from the band in 1982 precipitated a significant downturn in their fortunes. And while I stand by that assessment, the decline did not begin immediately. No. First came this. Now, the gods of Olympus were never known for their restraint when interfering in mortal affairs. And when Dio departed Black Sabbath, the gods, who had always taken an unhealthy interest in the affairs of hard rock music, could not resist intervening. Zeus hurled his thunderbolts from Olympus. Poseidon churned the seas in outrage, and Hades, no doubt, was preparing a special corner of the underworld for what was about to come. Even Athena, normally a model of restraint, is said to have raised an eyebrow. And from this divine tumult, this celestial overreaction, emerged the most unexpected consequence of all. Ian Gillan joined Black Sabbath. Now, at the time, or thereabouts in the band's history, so I was saying post Dio's departure, Iommi was known to have considered, at least, both David Coverdale and Robert Plant as replacements for Dio. I may have the chronology slightly out there, but I'm fairly sure it was around that time. Well, what can one say to that? I mean, clearly Iommi has an ear for a great voice, or was perhaps reputation and, industry standing, overriding his musical judgment. I certainly think there's an argument to be made from that, because I don't see too much musical compatibility with either. Plant in particular, one simply could not imagine him in Black Sabbath. His entire musical identity is just too far removed from Sabbath as a core character. Coverdale, on the other hand, is with some, mental contortions, just about more conceivable. For the time, he still possessed that wonderful, rich baritone that he'd had since, he joined Deep Purple, and he had not yet entered his sort of, 1987 and beyond, how shall we call this, his more enthusiastic phase, his screechy phase. And with a certain amount of imaginative generosity, one could perhaps place him in Sabbath. But I don't think his heart would ever have really been in it, would it? Certainly his blues and R&B instincts one would have thought would have been at considerable odds with, Sabbath's traditional sound. Can you really hear him singing War Pigs, Generals gather in their masses. Oh, baby. No. I don't think so. Which brings us to Ian Gillan, and, could one argue that he is also was an inappropriate choice? Well, no, I don't think you can. At least not for the same reasons, or just not quite in the same way. I would argue, for example, that Gillan possessed a more versatile voice than either Plant or Coverdale, and unlike Plant and Coverdale, he had already proven himself on genuinely heavy material. Listen to Deep Purple in rock, for example, or indeed some of the work produced by the Gillan Band. That was far closer to Sabbath than anything Plant or Coverdale had ever even attempted, really. You may cite, what can I say, Immigrant Song or something like that, but in Led Zeppelin. But these were one-offs comparatively. I can't think of anything Coverdale ever did that came even remotely close. So yeah, I think in that sense that Gillan has, he had come much closer to the the Black Sabbath idiom, then most certainly, either of those two. Okay, maybe you still would not say he was a natural fit, as some would doubtless argue that Dio was a natural fit. And all right, fair enough, but I would maintain that his appointment was not quite the utterly bizarre, inexplicable, drink and drug-fueled decision it is often portrayed to be. I think there was more synergy there than people want to give credit for. Now, we've all heard the story. Gillan loves to tell it, does he not? Iommi and Butler got absolutely rat-arsed at a pub in Oxfordshire. I think the Bear, if anybody's from Oxfordshire. Never been there. And they got absolutely paralytic to the point he couldn't remember joining the band. Well, okay. It's an amusing tale, no doubt. That must be, because he never gets tired of telling it. But, its veracity is rather beside the point, I think, ultimately, he did join the band, but if one is going to, look a little bit more deeply into this association, one could perhaps cast a more skeptical eye over Gillan's motivations at the time. What do I mean? Well, put simply, the Gillan Band had played their final show in December 1982. And despite the idiosyncratic brilliance of their music, in commercial business terms, they were not particularly successful. And this despite number one albums, hit singles, etc., etc. Again, not the place to discuss that. Now, if we add to that Gillan's well-published vocal issues around this time, which had made his performances on that last tour sporadic at best, and had, by many accounts, I think his included, necessitated, at the very least, rest and possibly even surgery. Thus, his sudden appearance, or reappearance, if you like, in Black Sabbath understandably caused some consternation among his former bandmates. However, I think there is a reasonably pragmatic explanation for this. At some point between the end of the Gillan Band and that now infamous drinking session with Iommi and Butler, there had been a meeting of the Deep Purple Mark II lineup. And the truth of the matter is, for all concerned, Blackmore, Gillan, Glover, Lord, Pace, all at that point could have done with something of a career boost. Now, having said that, for whatever reasons, again, not the place to go into that, the Deep Purple reunion was not immediately forthcoming. But I think it was clearly understood that once existing obligations, and perhaps one or two other issues, had been resolved, then the path would be open. Which, in practical terms, left Gillan with something approaching 12 months on his hands and very little to do. So one could say that the Sabbath offer came providentially. We shall return to that. Anyway, be that as it may, the point is that Gillan joined the band and Bill Ward returned, and off they went to write and record a record, despite the incredulity of the press and much of the wider rock fraternity. The result, Born Again, is, for me, far closer in spirit to the music of the original band than it is a continuation or extension of the music of the previous Dio era. There is little, if anything, on here that fits into that mainstream hard rock metal template that the Dio era had, brought forth on Heaven and Hell and, as I argued, regurgitated on Mob Rules. And frankly, there is, and I'm speaking stylistically here, not in terms of talent or ability or whatever, but there is absolutely nothing on Born Again which one could even imagine Dio singing. And also for the first time since Sabotage, I would say, a distinctly gothic flavor had returned to the band and their music. And furthermore, I would say for the first time since that Sabotage period, a more creative, adventurous, indeed more original and outré impulse appears to have infused their writing sessions, certainly compared, I think, to what they had done with Dio. And if it is as if, in my opinion at least, freed from the more structured conventions that had come to define the Dio years and its output, the band were reveling in the opportunity to cast aside the rulebook and once again indulge their creative, be it drug-fueled, instincts to the full. The album itself opens with Trashed, which for me is just a wonderful burst of controlled chaos. Structure is direct, it's punchy, it's built around a driving, almost reckless riff from Iommi. It feels both aggressive and fluid. At first glance, one could think, or this could be construed as another attempt to recreate Neon Nights. And while there are structural similarities, in particular with it being, the opening track, this is musically far more adventurous than either Neon Nights or Turn Up the Night on the Mob Rules, which was another obvious attempt, to recreate the former. Here, not only do the keyboards give this song an added dimension, which they do, but there's time tempo changes built into this one, especially into the chorus, which I think are just fantastic. It just makes that song, it just gives it that extra, credibility is not the word, is it? But it makes it much more interesting. And there is a definite sense of immediacy about this as the band, just tearing into this song without restraint. Now, Gillan's vocal performance is unhinged, yet uncannily precise. And it gives a certain theatrical edge to it, but not in the Dio way. And perhaps more is better to say he gives more personality to his vocal here for what is basically a tale of, it's a narrative of excess. We know the story. We'll get to it in a while, but And Butler's bass is immense on this album. Both his playing and its so prominent, which gives a very definite sense even of depth and propulsion to this song. Reinforces the riff rather than merely following it. And Bill Ward's drumming is loose, swinging, and very dynamic. His fills lend the track a sense of vitality that elevates the energy, and it's really good to have him back. It really is. It's just one of those. I absolutely love it. Put it that way. The next song, or the next track at least, Stonehenge, is an instrumental interlude, which is brief. Construction is minimalist, mostly keyboards and or bass effects, not 100% sure, but it's very textured, and it's very slow, ritualistic pacing. It is, I suppose, very much a soundtrack to any Dennis Wheatley novel. But something about it just feels like a descent into something ancient and ceremonial. Okay, it's no doubt a palate cleanser, or, well, maybe it isn't a palate cleanser. Maybe it is a genuine introduction to what comes next. But it's a highly effective one. Now, as the track, comes to its end, it fades into a very eerie but menacing pulse. And the transition from this to the next track is incredibly dynamic and works much like a jump scare is intended to work in a film. All of which, I'm sure I don't have to tell you, heralds in Disturbing the Priest, which is a standout in terms of structure and atmosphere, and it's just incredibly dynamic and atmospheric piece of music. The central riff is insane. It's demonic, it's oppressive. It unfolds slowly and deliberately, while Gillan's vocals on this are particularly striking. If you haven't heard them, you are not prepared for them. And, he moves so effortlessly between restraint and I can only describe as very explosive bursts. And the track does not begin in conventional form with the riff, but with an environment as it segues out of Stonehenge. It's a wash of effects, reverb, echo. Sounds like some processed voices in the background. It creates an almost liturgical unease, or liturgical even unease. Pronounce that properly, yeah. It's less an introduction than an invocation, and crucially the band delays the arrival of the riff, allowing that tension just long enough, allowing that attention to accumulate in what is, I suppose, technically an undefined harmonic space, but my God, it works. Gillan announces the song with a blood-curdling, almost frightening scream, just at that moment as the riff arrives. And the riff is... These things I sometimes find very difficult to describe, but it's deceptively simple, but masterfully constructed. It's got a slow grinding figure, but I think it's built on downward movement, giving it a sinking, oppressive quality. Lots of space between the notes, allowing each one to hang in the air and to resonate. And there's a dragging rhythmic feel to it that, at least to my ears, sits oddly but effectively behind the beat. It's not a continuous stream of notes, as riffs can be, but Iommi very, very cleverly, I think, uses the gaps between the notes as structural elements in this. And each chord lands with a weight, decays into silence, and leaves the listener anticipating and waiting for the next strike, which never appears quite as you would expect it. And the tone is thick, it is abrasive, very little ornamentation to it. But the focus is on the riff, and it's very impactful. Yes, there are background embellishments, but you cannot take your ears away from the riff. And it's one that's not designed to move along quickly, is it? No, it's more designed to press down on you, to squash you almost, physically. And what elevates the whole thing, for me at least, is how Bill Ward interacts with this. Rather than locking into a rigid groove or something, as perhaps Vinny Appice would have done, he plays with a loose, almost jazzy elasticity. He leans into the spaces left by Iommi, and uses fills as connective tissue rather than decoration. It's shifting emphasis to subtly destabilize the pulse on a track which very much feels like it's breathing. It's expanding and contracting rather than just marching forward. Groove is alive, unpredictable, and unsettling. Geezer Butler is also excellent on this. He reinforces the riff with a nice rounded fluid tone, so perhaps smoothing the edges of Iommi's phrasing, filling out the low end, which gives it a lot of depth, literally and figuratively. Gillan treats the riff almost as an adversary. His vocal lines push against it, alternating between measured, almost whispered lines, and sudden explosive outbursts. And the chant-like sections reinforce the quasi-religious atmosphere. And despite why they called the track the rather flippant, reason they called it Disturbing the Priest, the lyrics are to be read multiple times, I think. They're very profound in some ways. And it doesn't, it's not one of these things that relies on the particularly conventional verse-chorus structure, is it? It evolves, this song. The riff remains central to it, but, the band becomes increasingly animated, particularly Ward and Butler. And Gillan himself, he escalates from restraint to, near exorcistic force. His performance is simply outstanding, but it's worth noting the close similarity to the title track "Scarabaeus" from the Ian Gillan Band's 1977 album, from which the vocal melody appears to draw. But no, go listen to it. Yeah, something, even looking back through the band's past catalogue, there is something uniquely oppressive, yet never blunt and monotonous about this. It's claustrophobic in its density, and yet it had space to breathe. It's unstable in its shifting rhythmic feel. It's ritualistic, perhaps, in its riffing and its repetition. I think it's a very unique construction for the band. And I would also go on to say this is the best piece of music they have composed since The Writ. And it fully, in my mind, justifies the extra attention I've given it here. I don't normally go into that much detail on individual songs. And spiritually, again, as I've already alluded to, this does hark back to, I think the band were in their 70s creative peak. Vocally, however, it remains utterly unthinkable with either Osborne or Dio. Okay, we move on. The Dark, Zero the Hero. Now, the Dark section establishes, it's a slow, ominous build. It's doing the same sort of thing as did Stonehenge. It's just not as memorable or as long. And the piece only transitions into Zero the Hero. And as it does that, the tempo and aggression increases slowly but dramatically. The riff fades in as opposed to having the song fade out. Not often you hear that, but it works well enough here. Now, this song is based fundamentally on an immense meat grinder of a riff that marches relentlessly forward and takes absolutely no prisoners. And this is augmented even by some eerie atmospheric sounds. I don't know whether they're keyboards and or bass effects, as Butler is credited as playing such on the album. But I've never heard anything like it before or since, on a Sabbath album at least. Now, structurally, this is quite straightforward. As I said, its main features are its relentless, it's amazing riff and relentless driving passion. Now, if you're not familiar with this song, but are familiar with Guns N' Roses' Paradise City, then you are more familiar with this song than you think. For Slash, and I think he's admitted it, let's say, drew considerable inspiration. Now, as good as this is, and it is good, I have always thought that a couple of more musical twists and turns would have improved it. The sort of thing that informed, the majority of their epic scale tracks, and this is over 7 minutes. I suppose we can, we have to put it in that category. But it doesn't. It fades in, it grinds along, it fades out. There is no tempo change, there is no quieter section, no builds, there's nothing like that. I thought it might have benefited from that. And also, Gillan doesn't quite get it on this one. I don't think his vocal melody is that sympathetic to the underlying musical structure. And what the fuck his lyrics are about, I have absolutely no idea. But, it is how he is. If he finds good percussive words, that sound good in there, in the singing or speaking of them, he's quite happy to use them, whether it makes any sort of literal sense or not. But I don't think this is his best effort. Yeah. And I think, had he perhaps done a little better on this, it could easily have elevated the song. Maybe sacrilege to some. I know a lot of people, fans of this album, do look at Zero the Hero as the highlight. I'm not trying to do it down, but I stand by what I said. Okay, Digital Bitch up next, which is high energy, another riff-driven track with a more straightforward structure. Although there are slightly more twists and turns to it. It does slow down a little bit here. Has a middle eight, something you weren't guaranteed to get on a Dio era composition. But the construction here is tight and it's focused. It's built around this, again, this, as I've said, this sharp, aggressive central riff. And for me, it is probably the weakest track on the album. A relative judgment, of course, and equally, naturally, by default. Something has to be the weakest. Gillan's performance on this is biting, is almost playful in his venom, and injects, very much his personality into the song, which is, it's an attack on somebody, isn't it? It's, a great memorable riff from Iommi. Direct, punchy, is highly effective. Butler and Ward, again, doing what they've been doing all album on this, but this is not the musical highlight. Is it the most commercial track on offer? Probably. It probably is. But I think its main flaw is quite simply its lack of gravitas compared to the other tracks on the album. It's not bad, but it's just not at the level of the rest. Okay, Born Again, the title track, which is expansive and very richly layered. It unfolds with a sense of grandeur. It balances, the heavy riffing sections with the more acoustic, shall we say, atmospheric passages. You may be thinking, based on that description, something, like Children of the Sea, and fair enough. Having said that, one can't deny some level of similarity, but this is very much its own thing. Iommi's guitar work is particularly expressive. As he shifts between those, verses and the chorus, it's incredibly, heavy as it is, it's incredibly melodic. He really has stepped up to the plate on this album, I feel. And the song is simply quite majestic. And Gillan himself his vocals are commanding, astounding, almost operatic at times. And it really does lend the song a sense of scale and drama. It is an immense vocal performance. Butler and Ward are really into this one. The underlying musical, what they're playing, the underlying music, behind the riff, behind the vocal melody is superb. And it is an almost perfect display of how to balance power and subtlety. The atmosphere of this song is almost apocalyptic, and yet, when reading and listening to the lyrics, it is also strange, and musically as well, it is strangely uplifting. This is almost a perfect composition and performance. It is much underrated, and simply one of the best songs Black Sabbath have ever written and recorded. Okay, which takes on to Hotline, which track leans into a more energetic, almost hard-rocking approach. Structure is more compact and more efficient, again, driven by a really lively and really memorable riff, and another really strong, and I maintain interesting, rhythmic backbone. Gillan brings a lively, almost mischievous even, energy to the vocals. What they're about, I'm afraid I have absolutely no idea. Well, maybe there are just some things in life we're just not meant to understand. But again, once again, Butler and Ward, it's interesting what's going on here rhythmically. And it is, it's good to hear them back together again. I'm not knocking Vinny Appice, far from it. But it was just very different. Yet the mood is less oppressive than on the other tracks, offering perhaps a moment of relative respite or brightness within the album's darker palette. Yet it remains absolutely infectious, and again, almost criminally underrated. Now, the album itself closes with Keep It Warm, a track with slightly looser, more groove-orientated feel to it. Its construction emphasizes rhythm and feel rather than sheer heaviness. Having said that, it is constructed around yet another immense riff. Perhaps one of his best ever. But what truly stands out on this, musically at least, is the dynamics on play. The way the band navigate, there's a couple of tempo shifts here as they come in and out of the middle eight, and in particular how they come out of that, and they return to the central riff tempo and structure. It may be simple. It may appear simple, but often the best things in life are simple. It is to me just an absolute fantastic demonstration of exquisite control and musical instinct at the very, very highest level. And this is one of the, again, another band classic. Iommi is more restrained here by the nature of the song. And there's groove and texture rather than outright force. But I have to say his solo on this is immense. And something one I think can always say about Tony Iommi when it comes to a solo. I've never heard him hit a bad note or a wrong note. Everything he does is perfectly justified. Sonically, I don't know about musical theory, but there's never ever anything out of place, and this solo is an absolute gem. Gillan himself is a very warm, almost soulful vocal performance, which provides a striking contrast to the heavier, almost demonic moments found elsewhere on the album. And again, I have to say it, it's great to have Butler and Ward back together. Something understated about this track, but as I've alluded to, the way they're playing and what they're playing this should be better appreciated. Now, around the time of the recording sessions, they recorded at least one other song that didn't make it. It was released, was it 2011 when they did a remastered version of this? Anyway, called The Fallen. Now, what is immediately striking about this track, The Fallen, is how clearly it resembles the Gillan Band. Why? Again, sometimes these things are difficult to express in words, but there's just something about the jaunty character of the riff and the overall construction of it. It is not typical Sabbath, yet it remains unmistakably Sabbath. It's a strange but ultimately successful marriage of styles. It is perhaps a little unfinished, and perhaps that's why it wasn't included. But even so, one is left wondering, at least I am, whether it might have been a stronger inclusion than, then it would have to have been Digital Bitch. I suspect it would have been, although stylistically it may have sat slightly apart from the rest of the material. I also find it an interesting example, if my assumptions are correct, obviously, of how ideas are transmitted within a band, and how perhaps a new member can have can influence, a band, even perhaps, subconsciously somehow. What am I getting at? Well, Gillan, in keeping with his long-established method, was content to let the band develop the music, I'd say the backing tracks. And then they would present him with that, and he would go away and, superimpose his lyrics and vocal melodies upon it, and, and they would, as he said himself, they either liked it or nothing was said, and he realized he'd have to have another go. This has always been his preferred approach, and it remains so to this day. But in contrast, Iommi and Butler had by this point grown accustomed to a more collaborative, writing process. I think in particular when they worked with Dio, who was far more involved in shaping the songs at a structural level than Gillan was. And this is not to say that Gillan never fed ideas back into the process. Look, guys, if you just play that chord here, this is gonna. I'm sure that happened, but his role was fundamentally different, or the process was fundamentally different. Yet, having said that, and despite this perhaps more distinct division of labor, The Fallen still sounds remarkably like something that could have emerged from the Gillan Band. Just an interesting aside. Go listen to it for yourself, and especially if you're familiar with the Gillan Band. And, what do you think? Well, that was that. That was the album. What is there left to say? As I have already intimated, excuse me, this is easily the best thing Black Sabbath have produced since Sabotage. And in saying that, I obviously, going through their chronology to this point, yes, I'm aware of the implication. I do prefer this to the two Dio era albums. Why? Well, as I've already mentioned, the spirit here feels much more like the spirit of Black Sabbath and less like Rainbow. Songwriting steps, again, outside the mainstream conventions that characterize the Dio period. And as a result, I think the material feels stronger, more distinctive, and I think it's more consistently realized across the album. Again, Gillan truly does rise to the occasion, and he delivers extraordinary vocal performances across this, across these, 8 songs? 7 songs, even. 7 songs, yeah. And again, I go further. Gillan's vocals on Born Again are easily the finest to appear on any Black Sabbath album up until this point. And what initially may have seemed a very strange collaborative process has proven in practice to be unexpectedly fruitful. However, not everything is perfect, as we now shall see. Gillan's often criticized for his supposed lyrical incompatibility with Sabbath. Well, let's just examine that, shall we? And it's quite predictable that he would avoid the Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy themes favored by Dio. It's not his idiom whatsoever. But prior to his stint with Sabbath, Gillan's lyrical style had ranged widely. From the whimsical, Anyone's Daughter or No Laughing in Heaven, to things far more substantial. Again, he often indulged in humor and wordplay, which admittedly would have been out of place, one thinks, in Sabbath. However, there are numerous examples of his more serious writing, tackling more serious subjects, and not always, perhaps, in very direct, but more subtle, more subtle attempts to make more serious points. Some of his lyrics have been very profound and very meaningful, and I will mention but a few: Child in Time, Fools, When a Blind Man Cries, or even of more recent vintage, Born to Kill. Furthermore, much of Geezer Butler's work, in the original band, went on to deal with more grounded themes, war, drugs, religion, and wider societal concerns. When was the last time, Butler penned anything so obviously of the occult? They outgrew that, if you like, lyrically rather quickly, although, the image did stay with them. So having said that, where precisely is this supposed lyrical gulf? All right, you may argue that Digital Bitch may be a little lightweight or corny, and I would accept that. And on Trashed, which also received some lyrical criticism, but he was just recounting a real incident that occurred during the recording of the album, very much in the tradition of Smoke on the Water. If one considers that un-Sabbath, then it's a matter of taste. I personally do not. Him rhyming tequila with tequila does, raise an ironic eyebrow every time I hear it, but, come on. Nobody's perfect. Butler did rhyme masses with masses, so, there was a precedent, was there not? But on a more serious note, the lyrics to Disturbing the Priest and the title track are not only strong in their own right, but they're entirely keeping within the Sabbath oeuvre. And I would also argue that Keep It Warm is remarkably effective lyrically. So, I have to say that on balance, I don't think that particular criticism holds up to scrutiny. Okay, time to address the elephant in the room, the production. Now, Born Again is widely known for a dense, heavy, and often muddy production with strong emphasis on low-frequency content. The mix tends to compress multiple elements into the same sonic space, particularly in the mid to low ranges. Iommi's rhythm guitars, are heavily saturated and thick and frequently blend into the surrounding instrumentation rather than standing apart with any sort of clear separation. His lead guitar work, on the other hand, and his solos often do very much cut through with a very sharp, high-end, sometimes screeching tone. It is a bit off-putting, I do admit. And it does stand in stark contrast to the dense mix, of the rest, of the rest of the instruments. Not always great. I think particularly solo on Trashed, perhaps because it's the first one. They're like, oh wow, Again, Butler, his bass playing is prominent and forceful, but it occupies a large part of the low end. Certainly in terms of this mix, and it does by default of that, it does contribute much to the album's weight. Bill Ward, on the other hand, I think is rather ill-served. His drums are present, certainly, and with noticeable room ambience. I like the sound of his drums, but the mix can reduce the definition between the individual kit elements, softening their overall separation, and at times he's doing stuff, but you can't really you can hear it, but you can't discern it, or you can't hear it clearly enough. And again, across the album, there is a tendency for instruments to overlap in frequency and spatial placement, contributing to the perceived lack of clarity. High-end detail is present in places, certainly, particularly in Iommi's leads, but the overall balance remains heavily weighted towards, density and low-end power. Most people, the band included, hate it. And yes, over the years, various dubious explanations or excuses have been put forward, to explain it. I'm not going to go into those here. Yet to hear a convincing one. I'll put it that way. But after living with this, as it is, for 40 years, I somehow struggle to imagine the album sounding any different now. It's a bit like the cover, isn't it? It's either grotesque bad taste or it's just what was required, and I vacillate between the two, but one is just so used to it by this point. But in terms of the mix, again, I just love it. I suppose I've grown to love it, warts and all. And now for years now, Iommi has threatened to remix it, and he may well, at some point. I don't know. Next year, the year after, who knows? He may well do it. And fair enough. I mean, look, his remix of Forbidden made a huge positive difference to that album. And, if the Born Again remix ever materializes, I'll no doubt buy it, out of curiosity, if nothing else. But beware for what you wish for. Over 20 years ago now, the demo versions of the album leaked was where we first got to hear The Fallen. And I don't know what stage of the recording, because they weren't all complete. There were a couple of verses missing off Trashed and stuff like that, so it wasn't, there were working versions of the song, shall we say. But we were obviously, on these releases, the Manor tapes they're called, if anybody wants to look them up or check them out. They were obviously, what we're listening to is obviously the songs prior to the mixing process, as it were. And no, I mean, that's interesting. But a couple of things I did take from that, vis-a-vis the mix as we know it, is that actually the mix that the album got does contribute a rather lot to its atmosphere. And I wouldn't say the song sounded a bit thin without it, but it was the difference was noticeable. Again, that's maybe just a question of being used to something sounding that way for 40 years. I don't know. But anyway, look, the album was released and was, I think, charted in the UK at 4. I think charted in quite a lot of territories as well. And certainly the highest charting album since Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, on a decade previously. Although, despite the initial interest in it in America, it didn't certify. So I think that was the first time that might have happened for a while, but it was a precursor to similar results for the next few years. All right, now there is still so much to talk about regarding this iteration of the band, and I've gone longer than I intended to, so I will end it there, and next time we will pick this one up. There's still much to say. Some of it quite amusing, but won't spoil the surprise. But all right, anyway, thank you very much. As always, please feel free even to like, to share, to subscribe, and all those good things. And while I realize, as I said on my review of the Dio years, that I don't, I understand, or I accept the fact that I don't represent the popular view, which may well be the case here as well. But please feel free to comment. On that note, I thank you once again for your indulgence. I wish you well, and until next time, Mashonkia.